Battle of Yorktown. In this presentation, we will be discussing multiple topics including who was involved in the Battle of Yorktown as well as significant figures, why the events took place and why they were so important, where the events took place as well as where armies were located, the lead up to the battle and events that had sparked Yorktown, the battle itself, and casualties of war as well as the British surrender. Lastly, we will look at odd occurrences that took place before and after the battle. The Battle of Yorktown was fought by three armies, the three armies being the British, the Continental Army, or the Americans, and the French. The British Army was far superior in numbers when looking at the entirety of their army, but in the case of Yorktown, the British had roughly 6,000 troops. The Americans weighed in at about 8,800 troops, and the French had about 7,800 troops. The British were led by General Lord Charles Cornwallis, the Americans led by General George Washington, who would later become our first president, and the French led by Comte de Rochambeau. Rochambeau was not only an important figure because of his help throughout the war, but because of the French's help at the Chesapeake during the Battle of Yorktown. The Battle of Yorktown took place in Yorktown, Virginia, a small tobacco port at the time. The battle took place on September 28th through October 19th, 1781. The placement of Yorktown was a crucial part of Washington's plan. With the British placed on a small peninsula, their backs were essentially put against the wall. Washington saw this as a perfect opportunity to surround General Cornwallis. Yorktown would be the last major battle of the American Revolution. As you can see, marked by the red, the British Army was placed on the small peninsula with their backs on the York River. This would allow the French, marked in gold, and the Americans, marked in blue, to surround the British quite easily. The Battle of Yorktown was a very important battle, not just in the short term, but in the long term. It would give the Americans a much-needed win and a chance of defeating the British. Again, General George Washington saw this as an opportunity to surround the British and force them to surrender. With the British surrendering, the British war machine would finally be beaten. Although Yorktown would be the last major battle of the Revolution, the war would not technically end until the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783. In 1780, French troops had arrived in Newport, Rhode Island to help the Americans with their fight in the north. In August of 1781, the Americans and French troops would begin their march to the south after hearing of another shipment of French troops arriving in the Chesapeake Bay. On September 5, 1781, the French Navy will defeat the British Navy in the Battle of the Capes, making it impossible for the British to send in things like supplies and reinforcements through the bay. With the British fighting in the north alongside General Clinton, General Cornwallis decides to settle in Yorktown instead of moving to the Carolinas. Cornwallis would ask Clinton for aid in Yorktown. They would end up agreeing to send 5,000 troops to Cornwallis as reinforcements. Again, you have to remember, with the Americans and French fighting in the north, Cornwallis does not think an attack would be coming anytime soon. But because the French had troops arriving in the Chesapeake, that would allow the Americans and French, who would already be moving to Yorktown, to overwhelm the British. By mid-September, the Americans and French would arrive in Williamsburg, Virginia, about 13 miles from Yorktown. You can see Williamsburg in the top left corner and Yorktown just to the southeast. Again, you can see Yorktown placed on a small peninsula on the York River. The battle itself was not a single day, but over a span of 22 days. In the time before the battle, the British had built 10 small forts called redoubts. These redoubts would have artillery and connecting trenches. When this was happening, the remaining Allied troops in the north would attack General Clinton, delaying the troops he was supposed to be sending to General Cornwallis. Pictured here is the redoubt. As you can see, these are pits built by the British as temporary forts. They'd be equipped with artillery and had trenches that would connect them all together like a maze. You can see the spikes placed in the outer walls. These would be used as a defense mechanism from attackers. The attackers would be slowed down because they would either have to make their way over the spike or destroy it to even begin their climb of the outside wall. In that time, the defenders would be able to shoot any attackers who were being slowed down. As you can see, similar to the slide before, the attacking troops would be slowed down by the spikes, those spikes having to be destroyed, as you can see by the troops with axes in the bottom right. This would give the defending troops, in this case the British, time to shoot at the attackers. When the assault on the British finally began, Washington would order troops to take a new trench. To do this, they would have to take redoubts 9 and 10. The French would be given redoubt 9, the Americans would take 10. Leading the attack on redoubt 10 would be familiar founding father Alexander Hamilton, a colonel at the time. Hamilton was not a pick for General Washington's Continental Army, but convinced him into giving him a spot to prove himself in battle. Time was of the essence, and to speed up the attack, Washington orders the trenches not to be taken through a constant barrage of artillery, but for troops to fix bayonets and take them by hand. The battle would last all of about 10 minutes. Of Hamilton's 400 men, only 9 were killed and 30 wounded. The French would walk away with 27 dead, 109 wounded, all from their 400. Surrounded and blocked from receiving supplies, the British were left with nowhere to go. By October 16, the Americans and French were able to clear the remaining trenches. After the final trenches were cleared, General Cornwallis tries to evacuate but is stopped by a well-timed storm. On October 17th, the British would send forward a lone drummer boy and a single officer waving a white handkerchief, signaling a surrender negotiation. The British war machine had finally fallen. As you can see, compared to the other countries, the Americans fared quite well, losing roughly 80 men. The French, on the other hand, had lost 200 men, and the British 500. On October 19, 1781, General Cornwallis, claiming to be sick, does not appear to the surrender. He sends General Charles O'Hara to surrender to the French and Americans. With their surrender, they would lose roughly 6,000 men, guns, small arms, ammunition, and equipment. With most large events like this, there are usually a couple of things that happen that are out of the ordinary. When British troops had marched out to surrender, the British band played "The World Turned Upside Down," almost as a joke on the idea that the world must have turned upside down for the British to surrender. Another odd thing that happened was American and French officers had entertained British officers with a dinner party after their surrender. All were invited but one. Banastre Tarleton would not be invited because the Americans refused to sit him at a table. This was due to the atrocities his troops had committed during the war. An example of his ruthlessness was refusing to stop an attack on surrendering troops at Waxhaws. Colonel William Tavington from the movie The Patriot was based on Banastre Tarleton as well. Citations include the National Parks website, American Revolutionary War Facts.com, Eric Foner's Give Me Liberty, History.com, BritishBattles.com, DefendingTheLegacy.com, Battlefields.org, AOC.cub, CFR.org, and JSTOR.com.